Good morning and afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can all hear me, and thank you so much for joining us for session 8 of the IGF AGM. I had mentioned in the previous session that while it's a shame that we can't be together here in Geneva, as we typically are in October, it's great that we're still able to meet despite the pandemic, and wonderful to see so many familiar and new names with us here today. By way of introduction, my name is Alec Crawford, and I work with the IGF Secretariat. I will be moderating today's session on how the COVID pandemic has impacted responsible sourcing efforts across the supply chain. We have a number of speakers with us today for the discussion. However, before properly introducing them, I need to go over a few housekeeping points to ensure that everything runs smoothly. This platform may be new to many of you, but hopefully recognize the basic structure by now. I would assume that most of us are experts in online platforms. You'll see on the platform that you could select your preferred language at the bottom in the left-hand corner. The floor language is whatever language the speakers are speaking in, but you can also select English, Spanish, and French. We also, in the interest of time, will not be accepting speakers from the floor. But if you do have any questions, comments, or would like to chat to the other discussants, please use the messaging function on the right-hand side. We will not be running any polls in this session, so you don't have to worry about that one, and documents the same thing. You can choose your preferred view by clicking on the small icon in the upper right corner of the session. If you're having any issues, I would suggest trying to refresh the app. That seems to be the best way to troubleshoot any problems. So moving on to the session, we wanted to focus on how the COVID pandemic has impacted progress and momentum on responsible sourcing and due diligence, and where opportunities and openings exist for furthering action on conflict minerals during and after the pandemic. We'll be discussing with our panelists today the impacts that they've seen both at the policy and at the local level, through both live interventions and pre-recorded video testimonials from the field. We've got a full agenda, so without further ado, let me please introduce our first speaker, who is Yannick Kiewit from the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development for Germany. He works as a senior policy officer there, but he also sits as chair of the European Partnership for Responsible Minerals. And Yannick is going to share with us today some of the ways in which COVID has affected the momentum that was building on responsible sourcing. Yannick, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Alec. Dear honorable ministers, dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank the IGF Secretariat for giving the EPRM the opportunity to participate and speak at today's virtual session at this year's annual general meeting. As Alec mentioned, I'm here today in my function as the current chairperson of the European Partnership for Responsible Minerals, in short EPRM. The German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, currently holds the chair of the EPRM. For those of you who might not know the EPRM, it is a multi-stakeholder partnership with members from governments, industry, and civil society. Together, we aim to increase the proportion of responsibly sourced minerals from conflict and high-risk areas. We support socially responsible extraction of minerals that contributes to local development. The EPRM was set up as an accompanying measure to the EU Conflict Minerals Regulation. As such, the scope of the EPRM encompasses the so-called conflict minerals, or 3TG, being tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold. Corresponding to the EU regulation, the EPRM's geographical scope is global, both in terms of our membership and the producing countries we focus on. The IGF has asked me to open this session by sketching out how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted progress and momentum of responsible sourcing, and also where I see opportunities for furthering action on conflict minerals during and after the pandemic. Obviously, those are a big question in uncertain times, but I'm happy to share some of the topics and ideas that we have discussed among the EPRM membership. First, for the impact, let us look at the 3T minerals, tantalum, tin, and tungsten. If you had asked experts on responsible sourcing about the state of affairs in the 3T sector around a year ago, you would have heard mostly positive assessments, such as we're on a good path, things are progressing, or the major problems within the 3T sector are sorted, let's focus our efforts on gold now. However, only a couple of months later, we had to find out that this success is very fragile. During the current crisis, we have seen major 3T certification initiatives struggle for their survival, and we still don't know if all of them will make it. Turning to the gold sector, artisanal miners usually tend to scramble much more to make ends meet than in the 3T sector. And during COVID-19, we have observed very harsh economic impacts. During the height of the crisis, Congolese miners received only 30 to 50% of the global gold price for their own produce, in comparison to around 80% in normal times. This drop is so significant that it could not be compensated for by the rise in global gold prices. Here, the economically most vulnerable took the hit. Without adequate support, the drop in local prices combined with the various socio-economic and health impacts of COVID-19 have made artisanal miners even more vulnerable, with women and children particularly affected. At the same time, we saw a new group of actors emerge in the gold value chain. Capital-strong buyers and exporters, sometimes operating with chartered planes, took hold of the mostly informal gold trade. They were able to set the extremely low prices with artisanal miners, resulting in enormous margins for their own operations. What does this mean for the future of the gold value chain? Will these actors disappear, or are they here to stay? So much for the impact. Now let us look forward. I see three ways in which the EPRM can contribute to strengthening responsible sourcing today and in a post-COVID era. Firstly, we are currently witnessing a broad public debate in the consumption-heavy societies about the world after COVID. The central question is, do we want to build our economies back to the new normal, or do we want to build back better, meaning more responsibly and sustainably? In the mineral sector, the EPRM can make an important contribution to the effort of building back better. The EPRM has diverse membership with many actors of the 3TG supply chain represented. Together, we can mobilize resources, share knowledge, experiences, and best practices. As a member-driven organization, we welcome the input and ideas of our membership. This allows us to design and implement activities that are truly sustainable and have a positive impact on the ground. Moreover, through our networks, we raise awareness on issues of responsible sourcing in producing and importing countries alike. Bringing attention to the hardship of artisanal and small-scale miners in the COVID pandemic is important. We need to make sure that these issues are not removed from policy agendas, both on a local and a global level. Secondly, the EPRM is financing pilot projects in the ASM upstream sector. The project fund seeks out innovative approaches and scales up workable solutions with tangible impact. Until now, we have financed 11 projects, and under the current call for proposals, we have received 28 new project ideas, of which some will receive project financing after assessment. We all know that there is no blueprint for dealing with the issues we encounter in the ASM sector, given its complexity and fluidity. Measures need to account for local conditions, the mineral produced, the geographic location, and the wider socio-economic context. This holds true in the COVID era more than ever. The EPRM Project Fund is a great tool for identifying context-specific solutions with the potential for wider application. I can only encourage civil society organizations or mineral supply chain companies to look out for the next call for proposals and hand in your project ideas. Thirdly, the EU Conflict Minerals Regulation will enter into force in less than 3 months. This is an important milestone for responsible sourcing in the 3TG sector. As the EPRM, we support companies in improving their due diligence in line with the regulation, for example, through our Due Diligence Hub. The Hub is an online platform which offers resources for companies that want to make their supply chains more responsible. Looking forward, we want to extend the support to producing countries. We want to assist ASM miners, but also governments and civil society actors in managing the impact and implications of the EU regulation successfully and sustainably. This leads me to my final point, an invitation. Many of you here today represent the governments of producing countries. Let me encourage you to engage with the EPRM on the EU regulation. As a multi-stakeholder partnership, we will greatly appreciate and benefit from your perspectives and your input. In case you're interested in becoming a member or you would like to get in touch with us, I will share the contact details of the EPRM Secretariat during the Q&A session, but also in just a second in the chat box. So please feel free to reach out. On that note, let me conclude and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yannick, for that very insightful overview of where things currently stand on 3TG and responsible sourcing in general. It's great for us to keep in mind the fact that what seemed so far away for so long is, in fact, just 3 months away with the new EU regulations. So great to keep that in mind. Our next speaker is having a bit of trouble connecting, but I think that we'll be able to speak to Louis by audio only. So some of you may be familiar with Louis Marichal from the OECD. Louis is the Minerals and Extractive Sector Lead for the OECD, and his work focuses on responsible sourcing and in particular the application of the OECD's due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains. Again, unfortunately, I don't think we can get him on video, but Louis, if you can hear me, I wanted to conduct this. Great, welcome. I wanted to conduct this as more of an interview and a back and forth than just a presentation. So I was hoping you could give us a bit of insight on how governments are seeing this play out. What kind of impacts are they seeing the pandemic having on responsible sourcing on the policy side?
Thank you, and apologies for joining a bit late. I had some trouble connecting. Unfortunately, I missed Yannick's presentation. Apologies for that, and thank you for having the OECD again. From everything that we've been told and that we've seen so far, the pandemic has had a stark impact on the ground for artisanal miners. That's a reality. But as far as we can tell on the policy side of things, it is not halted or stopped governments that were already engaged in the development of regulations or incentive measures in their initiatives. So quite strangely from our side and from our standpoint, the pandemic has not had a decisive impact on the policy making aspect of things related to responsible sourcing. And of course, it's not just governments, it's also the industry that, as you may know, has been taking some strong initiatives to support responsible sourcing and due diligence in mineral supply chains. So on both fronts, I have to say that so far, we haven't seen any negative impacts. Of course, it's not the same thing for the impacts on the ground for miners. But again, on the policy side of things, it's so far it hasn't been that bad.
Well, that's reassuring to hear, I think, and hopefully that continues going forward, despite the uncertainty that we're all living with on how long this will stretch out and what the economic fallout will be from this pandemic. Getting to that final piece that you alluded to, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on those on-the-ground workers and how you see, with the miners themselves or maybe across other supply chain actors, how you're seeing the pandemic affect, again, responsible sourcing in particular.
Yeah, I mean it's been quite varied across mineral supply chains because they have a lot of differences. One of the most impacted, I guess, has been the gold supply chain for various reasons, actually, because even though it has impacted the production and trade of gold, extraction kept going on in most producing countries. Now, one of the side effect that we have seen is increasing presence from illegal and criminal organizations that have benefited from the extraction on the ground. So that would be for gold. For other mineral supply chains, we have seen challenges as well. but it seems that to some extent, the various stages of the supply chain have been able to adapt. Has taken some time, and everything's not solved yet. But I think from what we've heard and what we've seen, the one supply chain that's been impacted the most and to some extent exploited the most has been the gold supply chain.
Do you see, Louis, whether there was kind of an immediate response and things have started to kind of improve since the early days of the pandemic, or have the problems that we've seen in the gold sector kind of continued throughout? I guess, have governments and other actors started to get a handle on these things, or is it persisting?
To some extent, the issues are still lagging, but with the reopening of borders and even though limited airline connections, the gold supply chain has been able to adapt. What we've heard from prices that are paid on the ground to artisanal miners, those prices have picked up again. So it seems that the supply chain has to some extent adapted, but obviously you still have a lot of remaining challenges.
Yeah, those aren't going to go away overnight. Thanks so much for those insights, Louis and Yannick. We'll have a chance to come back to both of you at the end of the session, I hope, with questions from the audience. So again, if you're online and you do have a question, please put it in the messaging tab to the right. Given that this is a discussion about responsible sourcing, we really wanted to turn to other supply chain actors as well to get their insights. So what we've done is we've collected a series of pre-recorded testimonials from stakeholders working across the supply chain on these issues, from ASM operations to refiners, to give us a picture of how the pandemic is impacting momentum on responsible sourcing. Our first video comes from Nubule Mabikwa, who is a program officer with the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. Nubule will explain what the pandemic has meant for the women miners that she works with. So if we could cue up that first video, that would be great.
Nubule Mabikwa, and I'm a project officer with the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA. With financial support from EPRM, we're implementing a project that seeks to promote safe, traceable, and responsible artisanal and small-scale gold mining in Zimbabwe. We're implementing this project together with a group of women, called them Tandazo Women Miners, who are based in Kwanda, Zimbabwe. I am briefly going to talk about how the pandemic affected the women in their gold operations over the past 6 months. In an effort to reduce the spread of the pandemic, our government announced national shutdown in March 2020. And that forced the women to send away their workers in response to the shutdown, to send them back to their homes and leave only skeletal staff who will provide security services and also will be servicing their equipment. And that was a huge knock for them because they had to stop production. And before they sent away their workers, they had to pay them, something they're not prepared for, as many miners live from hand to mouth. What they produce is what they then quickly use to pay their workers. So that was one. The next challenge was the closure of borders. Most miners in Zimbabwe rely heavily on neighboring countries to import the equipment that they use for their mining. And when the borders were closed, that meant they couldn't import their equipment. And that was a huge knock for them because then they had to use locally available products that had doubled in price because of the increase in demand. That was the other challenge that the women faced. Eventually, the president then exempted the mining sector as one of the critical services that can operate during the shutdown. But that wasn't something the miners were excited, but it had huge implications on how they're going to get their workers back to come and start working since they were in different cities and they had been intercity shut down. So they managed to round up people, but production was still slowed down as they didn't have as much as they usually do during normal times. That was the other challenge, and that led to reduced production. There was less production of gold and less working hours, and that had a huge knock on the women. The other challenge is with the closure of the borders, Fidelity Printers, who is the sole buyer of gold in Zimbabwe, did not have sufficient foreign currency to pay the miners. So while the miners produced what they did, when they delivered at Fidelity Printers, they did not get their payment on time. Some have shared that it took as long as 2 weeks to get their payment. So shortage of foreign currency was another huge challenge that the women faced and that miners faced and the country as a whole faced. The next challenge that the women faced was the extra costs that were incurred as they tried to incorporate COVID response in their safety, health, and environment culture. So they now had to make sure they work in accordance to the WHO guidelines, where they had sufficient and appropriate masks for the workers, where social distancing was respected and observed, and also where they had to put water on every entry point, provide hand sanitizers, and make sure there was running water for the miners to use. So there was an extra cost that came with that as they tried to respond to the pandemic. The other challenge is movement was restricted. So the group has some women who are actually disabled women, and because of the restriction in movement, those women were not able to move around. Usually when they move around with their aids, and the restrictions in movement and the limitations in number of people who can be in a vehicle, that really affected the operations of the disabled women who are working with under the project.
Our next video moves us down the supply chain to the refining process. So Virginie Baron is the head of corporate affairs at Valcambi in Switzerland, and she will describe how COVID and the pandemic have affected their business.
Good morning, good afternoon. I would like to thank the IGF for inviting Valcambi to this panel discussion. Valcambi currently sources from ASMs in Peru and Colombia. In Peru, all the mines we source from have had to suspend at some point their operations, some for longer than others, depending on the regions. And now they have gradually restarted operating at lower capacity and, of course, implementing very strict COVID measures. In Colombia, the mines we source from have continued to ship to Valcambi, but we have received much lower volumes. All this, of course, has financially impacted the miners. So at Valcambi, our challenge, our focus has been on working with our shipping agents to find routes to get the gold out of the country to Valcambi. Given the limited number of flights, they've had to commingle some shipments when normally we would do individual shipments when the production is available. In parallel, we have supported some mines in their liquidity. We have also continued to support two mines in Peru to achieve their fair trade certification. And we have applied a retro certification for these mines so that they can enjoy the fair trade premium prior to being certified. As you can imagine, onboarding new mines has been very challenging during COVID and is still very challenging because on-site visits is mandatory as part of our due diligence process. And given the travel restrictions, it's been very difficult. In this sense, an official recognition by the LBMA and the RJC of the fair trade and fair mind scheme as a valid replacement of the on-site visits would be hugely helpful. And any cost saving would allow to propose even more favorable conditions to the miners. In parallel, the Swiss Better Gold Association, of which Valcambi is a member, has supported the mines which are under the Better Gold Initiative program. In Peru, the support has been in supporting the miners to resume their operation, implementing security protocols. In Colombia, the SBGA has distributed 1,300 food packages to the traditional artisanal miners called the barriqueros in Choco. Also in Colombia, 8 mining operations under the BGI program have benefited from financial support in 2 aspects, implementing the security protocols, but also in job retentions. Now, Valcamp is more than ever committed to supporting ASMs, given the circumstances, the hard, the difficult situation they're facing. And we continue as we can to progress on a number of programs, hoping that a number of mines will come on stream in 2021. Thank you very much.
I find it watching both those videos, I find it really inspiring just how adaptive, how quickly adaptive companies and individuals and groups and associations are showing themselves in the face of these often insurmountable, seemingly insurmountable challenges. We're going to stay in Latin America for our next video to explore with Natalia Uribe of the Alliance for Responsible Mining what the pandemic has meant for responsible sourcing from ASM miners in particular in Colombia.
Is Natalia Uribe from the NGO Alliance for Responsible Mining. I want to present today the COVID-19 impact to the artisanal and small-scale mining communities that are part of the Project Capaz Passport to Market program. The project was led by Alliance for Responsible Mining and Resolve, thanks to the support of European Partnership for Responsible Minerals. The CAPAS project, through the use of the crowd code, seeks to encourage the early and sustainable connection of artisanal and small-scale mining producers with formal markets in accordance with the OECD due diligence guidance. The project was implemented at 2 levels, internationally with the development of the crowd code 2.0 and nationally in Colombia in 2 ASM cooperatives in the municipalities of La Llanada and Los Andes in Nariño, and 1 artisanal and small-scale mining women organization in Suarez, Cauca, Colombia. These 3 municipalities in which gold mining is the main economic activity and one that generates the largest number of direct and indirect jobs. The COVID-19 impacts to the artisanal and small-scale miners in the project. In the context of the global crisis generated by COVID-19, artisanal mining communities are exposed to a number of risks described as much more than a health crisis. It has also triggered devastating social, economic, and political crises that will leave deep scars. The miners report 100% of suspension of their activities. The sector experienced difficulty keeping payroll payments. The miners also indicate increase between 45 and 60% in costs related to the adoption of safety protocol, purchase of supplies, as well as food and basic needs. And unfortunately, illegal armed groups intend to interfere with the restart of labors and operation. Considering this situation, the team adopts some strategies. The training, workshop, consulting have to done virtually. Miners demonstrate high interest. However, the challenge is the lack of connectivity in rural areas and little knowledge of participants in online platforms. And carry out other support actions. Miners of the project participate in a COVID-19 impact research in April. And carry out a fundraising campaign organized to economically support the most vulnerable artisanal miners in the project of Colombia and Peru. Finally, we want to point out some opportunities for governments and industry actors to support the sector. ASN is a key sector to reactivate local post-COVID economies. Connectivity, regularization, banking, and marketing to differentiate markets require connectivity and digital literacy. Differential approach in mining law. Move further on policy and regulation change that with a differential approach reduce the burden of formalization requirement according to the condition of the sector. Encourage integration of artisanal and small-scale mining with international supply chain that includes favorable conditions for producers, such as craft code, fair mine, RGC, between others. Formalization efforts and support. Make basic campaigns that aims to the formalization of gold traded in the municipality, start interinstitutional projects and actions that promote financial inclusion, and encourage coexistent relationship between artisanal mining and small, medium, and large-scale mining, as well as formal traders. These are all the articles and recommendations related with ASM and COVID-19, and thanks again for this fantastic opportunity to be part of the forum.
Just a note, we can share the presentations from both CAPAZ, or both from the Alliance for Responsible Minerals, as well as from IPIS, who we'll be turning to next. Our final testimonial moves us back to Africa. Lotte Hex is a conflict and natural resources researcher with IPIS, and she's going to discuss some of the help, with some help from colleagues in the field, some of the impacts that the pandemic has had on responsible sourcing from ASM operations in 3 Central and East African countries. This will be our final pre-recorded testimonial.
Since the outbreak of COVID-19, the International Peace Information Service, in short IPIS, closely monitors the impact of the pandemic on the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, as well as national supply chains, through structured quantitative and qualitative data collection. IPIS has been working through its long-established network of local surveyors who have conducted mobile phone surveys between May and August 2020. In northern Tanzania, we researched 37 mining sites. In the Western Central African Republic, this were 105 mining sites. And in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, 96 mining sites. To assess the impact of COVID-19, this data is compared with data collected by IPIS in previous years on the same mining sites. In this presentation, we will outline some general trends that we observed in the 3 countries. Obviously, the context in the 3 countries is different, and more details on each of the countries can be found in the published reports. As soon as the borders with neighboring countries were closed, exporting facilities testified great difficulty to export, and many ceased to pre-finance traders. Consequently, traders were low in cash, and many of them stopped visiting mining sites. At the same time, respondents in the CER and the DRC reported that new buyers visited the mining sites. These were, for example, local businessmen attracted by the decreased mineral prices. The lack of liquidity among local traders forced miners to accept significant lower prices for their mineral production. Compared to our baseline data and relative to the international market price, prices of gold, diamonds, and 3Ts decreased since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. The IPIS researchers in the 3 countries will now explain how the pandemic has affected their mineral trade in the country.
The main impact of COVID-19 among mining communities in northern Tanzania was lack of access to international markets as well as low pricing of their minerals.
L'impact du COVID-19 dans le secteur artisanal minier en Centrafrique a profondément affecté la production nationale avec une baisse des acheteurs ou collecteurs.
This example from the CER shows that the gold price has decreased as a percentage of the world market price, and since May 2020, slightly recovered.
Suite au Covid-19, les activités minières ont connu une perturbation sérieuse au niveau du pays et en particulier au Sud Kivu. Les banques ont manqué de liquidités, les entités de traitement ont manqué également de liquidités pour acheter les minerais chez les négociants. Les négociants ont choisi la voie de stocker leurs minerais parce que les prix avaient tellement baissé.
This example shows that also in the DRC, gold prices have decreased as a percentage of the world market price and slightly recovered since May 2020. In all 3 countries, we conducted multiple surveys over time to assess to what extent the situation has been recovering. In all 3 countries, we found that trade was reviving and that price levels went up again. However, both in Tanzania and the Central African Republic, diamond prices did not recover. They remained low at around 50% of the prices paid before the outbreak of COVID-19. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has learned us that the artisanal and small-scale mining communities are vulnerable because of their direct dependency on pre-financing. At the same time, the ASM sector also showed its resilience, as it is already recovering to some extent since international borders have been reopened. The pandemic has made the inequalities in mineral supply chains very clear. Mining communities greatly suffered, while illicit actors had the best profit margins in a long time. Finally, although mineral supply chains are complex, the pandemic has shown that the links between each level in the supply chains are very close. For example, for gold, the Swiss refiners, the Dubai buyers, the exporters in countries, and the miners are closely connected, as changes in one link had direct and timely impacts on the other links. These lessons make apparent the critical importance of supply chain due diligence from mine to market. COVID-19 has also impacted responsible sourcing. As many have flagged, the COVID-19 pandemic may present an opportunity for some people. Miners desperate to sell and the growing margins create opportunities for illicit traders and conflict actors to engage in the sector. Moreover, widespread cash flow issues in Eastern DRC resulted in increasing levels of barter trade, in which miners offered minerals in exchange for essential goods. These practices create serious concerns for mineral supply chain traceability, as these minerals will be hard to trace. Thank you for listening to this presentation. In the coming months, IPES will continue to research the impact of COVID-19 on the artisanal and small-scale mining sector in the Central African Republic and Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. We will publish the results of these analyses on our website.
So that brings to a close our pre-recorded testimonials from actors working in the field on these issues. And if you were with us for the previous session on ASM and COVID, you can see overlap between both that and efforts to really ensure that mineral supply chains are responsibly managed to minimize the impact that they have, the extraction and trade of minerals has on human rights abuses and conflict. As I mentioned in between the second and third video, I think it's really encouraging in a way to see the flexibility and the adaptability of supply chain actors to respond to the pandemic and attempt to keep that momentum going. It's unfortunate for a number of reasons the pandemic happened when it did, but there was a lot of momentum building on really trying to address the conflict implications of mineral sourcing. And this has, unfortunately gotten in the way of some of those, but I think as you can see from the videos that we shared today, those efforts haven't completely been reversed. There's still momentum moving forward on this issue, and there's still reason for optimism, I think. We do have time for a Q&A with Yannick and Louis, who are both still on the line. So I would encourage you to include any questions you might have in the chat box or the messaging function on the right-hand side. The first question was one for Louis, but Yannick, you can jump in here if you have any thoughts as well. We had a question from Ashley Smith-Roberts, who asked, she says, you mentioned the gold supply chain has likely been one of the most impacted. You noted, however, that the price ASM workers are able to receive for gold in the field does seem to be recovering a bit, which suggests that supply chains are beginning to adapt. However, you mentioned challenges in the gold supply chain remain. What are some of these ongoing challenges, please? So across the supply chain, what are some of the challenges that we're still being faced with, Louis?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the main challenges is one that's broadly applies to the entire economy. It's one of uncertainty. And as long as you will have this uncertainty, you will have issues with sourcing and with long-term perspectives for the miners themselves. And that has an impact on prices as well. The fact that gold has recovered slightly better off than other commodities is also due to the fact that gold is a safe haven in periods of difficulties in the economy, which can explain this slightly different trend. But of course, as long as the global economy doesn't really pick up, the demand for minerals and metals will not pick up either. So that's the key challenge, I guess, at the moment for the miners themselves. It's the demand and the associated prices of the commodities.
Thanks, Louis. Yannick, anything to add to that one?
No, not to that question. Thank you.
Okay, we had another question from Karma Chopal in Bhutan, who asks, what are some of the success stories of assistance from governments to the ASM sector? And we can, again, try to focus on responsible sourcing in particular, I think. But do you have any success stories that you can share where you've seen it being done correctly?
I'm happy to take that first if you want. I mean, talking from the responsible sourcing perspective, we have seen interesting developments over the past 6-7 years in the DRC, in particular, in relation to due diligence systems on the ground connected to formalization processes in 3T mineral supply chains. So that has proven to deliver some result, in particular, in improving security around mine sites and improving exports as well of 3T production by ASM communities. In the rest of the world, you have seen pockets or some countries where formalization approaches in the gold sector have yielded some results. Some countries in West Africa, for instance, but it's true that it's or in Asia, but it's true that we're still missing this one sort of perfect example of a well-designed government approach to formalization. And the reason for that is that it's extremely challenging, and all contexts are very different. So there is no silver bullet. It's really a very lengthy process to build on the successful experiences of various governments in order to understand how we can shape together a common approach to formalization. I don't know if we will ever be able to achieve that. But it's a good attempt to try to do that, because there has been some interesting examples.
Great, thanks, Louis. Yannick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think Louis summed it up pretty well already. And as I mentioned during the presentation, the feeling that we had prior to COVID-19 was that at least within 3T, responsible sourcing, the international community on various levels had made great strides, and it was really the gold sector that was kind of the outlier, and the one mineral that we had to worry most about. And I think that has to do with various reasons. One being that gold is very small, easy to smuggle, and does fetch high prices in illegal markets. But now, to turn to the question of any success stories, I mean, I can speak from the perspective of the EPRM, of course, and I would encourage you to go to the website. I will, sorry, I haven't done that yet. I will share the link in the chat box in just a second. And there is an overview of projects that are ongoing currently with EPRM funding, but also some that we have and that we have completed already. And these speak to various aspects and tackle various aspects of ASM mining and formalization efforts. So please have a look. There's some really, really great examples. One presented here today, Capaz. They are now in their second phase. In the first one, they developed a standard for market entry of ASM gold mining that is now being applied to some pilot mines. So yeah, please take a look there. And I think, yes, Gabriela, thanks for posting the link in the chat box. There's some great examples to have a look at.
Terrific, thank you so much. it is kind of unfortunate the speed with which some illegal and illicit activities, seized, or criminal activities seized some ASM sites. But there's great hope that governments and other actors can get that under control as quickly as possible. We do have a handful of other questions, and maybe I'll ask a couple, and you can choose which one you want to answer unless you want to answer them all. But we had a question on diamonds, which is recognizing it's outside of the remit of both the EPRM and the due diligence guidelines, but maybe you can offer some insights on with the sharp fall in prices and lingering difficulties in the global diamond retail business. Have ASM miners stopped mining alluvial diamonds altogether in some areas? Second question is, are you seeing any changes in how and if companies are ensuring due diligence in their operations in the gold sector? I think this links back to what you were saying, Yannick, about building back better and thinking about new ways to approach old problems. So are companies kind of changing the ways that they're approaching due diligence and responsible sourcing? And then we also had a comment on larger responsible sourcing initiatives. So can you comment on the impact of COVID-19 on bigger responsible sourcing initiatives such as the Global Battery Alliance and due diligence requirements from supply chain legislation? So I'll leave it at those three for now. I think we have time to get to them all, and we might have time for one last question.
I'll go first if that's okay. Just on the diamonds question, sorry, I sort of missed it. Just wanted to clarify first that diamonds are covered by the mineral supply chain guidance. The OECD guidance applies to all mineral supply chains. But sorry, I missed the question, so I'll leave it to Yannick. Second question, sorry, I should have taken notes. Second question was?
The second question was on if companies are approaching due diligence in a different way.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure to what extent this is related or not to COVID, but in the gold industry, for sure, there is now much more in-depth understanding of what due diligence means and the importance of ASM for the gold supply chain. So in turn, this means that companies are trying to adjust and adapt their due diligence systems in order to be able to progressively, I guess, in the medium term, source increasingly from ASM. This is a shift that we're seeing not just in the gold sector, by the way, but in other supply chains that ASM is increasingly acknowledged. Another interesting development that we've seen is also an increased understanding of the various risks associated to recycle sourcing, so sourcing scrap and recycled materials. So yeah, again, I'm not sure to what extent this is absolutely linked to COVID, but it's true that over the past 12 months, we've seen a much more in-depth and qualitative approach to due diligence from companies in the gold supply chain. The last question on the impact on initiatives such as the Global Battery Alliance. Again, not so sure to what extent this is related to COVID, but as I just outlined, I mean, this acknowledgement of major companies such as Tesla and Glencore of the importance of ASM and responsible sourcing of ASM for battery minerals is a great shift in the responsible sourcing world. So we've passed from an era where we had to fight to make sure that ASM was acknowledged as a genuine part of the industry to a position now where large multinationals and multi-commodity traders want to be more involved in responsible ASM sourcing. So to us, that's a major shift that we've seen over the past 12 months.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, it's unclear whether that's related to COVID or not, but it's certainly reassuring to know that if it was underway prior to the pandemic, it hasn't been derailed by the pandemic, and it seems as though commitments to responsible sourcing haven't wavered. If anything, they've been kind of retrenched and solidified. Yannick, did you want to chime in on those questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the questions. Unfortunately, on the first one on diamonds, I'm also not really an expert to speak to that. So yeah, I'm sorry about that. The second question and the third, I would just like to add 1 or 2 points. And again, I think your assessment is right, Alec, that you know, it's hard to see what of the momentum in responsible sourcing or due diligence, also on a company level and policy level, is related to COVID, and you know what is simply continuation of what has happened before. But on gold, but I mean, one interesting you know, event will be the EU regulation entering into force in 2021, and gold being one of the minerals. You know, I would assume that more companies now increase their due diligence efforts in the gold sector naturally, because they fall as importers within that or under that regulation. And the second development, and this is maybe not so much related to sourcing, but I guess in the gold sector, you do, when you talk about due diligence and where the pressure on companies comes from, gold is well produced and you turned into jewelry, and this is much closer to consumers, and we're seeing pressure also from that side. You know, people buying certain products and wanting to know where they come from, and that then forces companies or alerts them to the fact that, you know, they should step up their due diligence efforts. So that, I think, is a specific momentum also in the gold sector. Then for the third question, how does this influence or impact bigger initiatives? I think what Louis said is absolutely right, and we're witnessing this here in Germany as well. You know, this idea of building back better, but also the impact that you know, all the green recovery deals and you know, just a turn in the mobility sector, for example, towards more climate neutral transport systems, but also the expansion of renewable energy and the mineral demand for those sectors. And this is also has happened prior to COVID. This is really, well, I would say heightened public scrutiny, but also, you know, companies now much more, and also on a policy level, think about where do the minerals come from. You know, how do we get them? The demand will increase dramatically. So the ASM sector and the problems associated with it are now much more present also on those levels here. Yeah,
Perfect.
thanks.
Thanks very much, Yannick. We've run out of time, so unfortunately no more questions. There was a question from CIR. I would almost recommend that Lotte, I think you're online, you could perhaps in a private chat reach out to Jean-Benjamin to try to answer that question. I'm going to put you on the spot. So with that, I think we'll close the session. I would first and foremost like to thank our speakers today for their contributions. Because we're not in one place together, we'll just do this. So deafening cheers. You can't hear from the cheering in the room. But yeah, I thought it was a great discussion. We should also keep in mind that while the EU regulations apply to 3TG, I believe once they're in place next year, they will you know, potentially expand beyond that initial basket of minerals and metals. So there's scope for this to expand even further, which is great. Thank you again for joining us. Have a nice rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope that you'll be able to stay with us. Take care.